I did want to ask you about DMT. I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was you and maybe Charles who wrote some kind of review paper looking at DMT facts and myths. And DMT is super interesting at the level of the chemistry, at the level of the effects, but it also seems to be one where many uh, myths or sort of half truths have permeated throughout the internet. And so, can you just give people a short background of DMT, the basics of DMT, what it is and what we know about it? And I do have a few questions that I wanted to ask you that I see people saying a lot online.
So I was invited to a breaking convention meeting in, I think it was 2017. And Dave King contacted me and he said, we were going to have a session on DMT as a neurotransmitter. And I said, well, I don't believe it is. So you don't want me. He said, no, that's why we want you there, because the other people are going to say it is, and then we want your other opinion. So I gave the talk, and I had a lot of colleagues afterward come up and say, you should publish that because this is out of control. Everybody's talking about DMT. Strassman had made a suggestion. I think that DMT might be produced by the pineal gland when people were born and when they died. So I wrote a paper which was published peer-reviewed, and I said, this is just really not possible. The pineal gland is 180 milligrams. To get an intoxication with DMT, you'd need to produce about 25 milligrams, and it's just not possible. And that's not its principal function is to produce melatonin, which regulates the diurnal cycle, and it doesn't make that much melatonin. So this idea that there's an endogenous psychedelic has really stirred up a lot of people's passions. Oh yeah, it's a psychedelic. Why does a human body make it? Why is it there? Well, it turns out DMT is made by lots of things, including lots of plants. And it's a component of the cerebrospinal fluid in lots of mammalian species. I think it's just there because there's an enzyme that methylates it, and it's a byproduct. But they've come back, and there was another paper by Dean et al. In 2019, which you may be referring to. My son and I wrote a response to that and said, this is just crazy thinking. But it's such a popular meme. This DMT is a really powerful substance. Well, it's powerful in the sense of what it does when you smoke or give an intravenous amount. But the amount it takes to do that is fairly substantial. And there's no evidence, and they've gone in with, they've looked at microdialysis in brains of rats, and they can detect trace amounts of DMT. They can detect lots of things. But that's what they're looking for. It's they're convinced that DMT is doing something, and so they're trying to prove how it's there and why it's there and what it's doing. I just don't think it is from a pharmacology point of view, biochemical point of view. There's no reason why it should be produced there, and it's not produced in sufficient amounts. So then people say, well, what about the lungs? There's a lot of one of the methylation enzymes is the indolamine N-methyltransferase, INMT. Say, well, there's a bunch of that in lungs. Why isn't it produced in the lungs? What was its function being? We're not hallucinating all the time. Oh, but when we die or when we have a near-death experience. And I pointed out, you don't need to invoke DMT because when you have a lot of stress, you have this whole endorphin system. You have endorphin itself, which activates kappa receptors. Kappa receptors are the same receptors as salvinorin accent. And I said, and even in the papers where they talked about killing these rats by suffocation and looking at the production of these compounds, I said, when you're stressed, all kinds of things are produced. It's a whole soup of neurochemicals that are, you're killing the animal and everything is going awry. So you're going to pick DMT out when you've got all these other things. And endorphins are much more potent than DMT. And we know that endorphins produce psychoactive effects in people. So there's just, in my opinion, there's just no reason to really look at it other than it's kind of a cute hypothesis. But plants don't hallucinate. Plants produce it. So I just think it's a metabolic byproduct.
So to summarize, there's no known physiological function of DMT in the mammalian nervous system, in the mammalian body. It's probably not produced at physiologically relevant levels. And the only time that they've seen sort of elevated levels was in the study that we're referring to by Strassman and others. but the elevated levels of DMT, they found those, but everything was sort of elevated because that's just what happens when you kill an animal like that.
They said it's a brainstorm of neurochemicals. So it's everything is being released. Serotonin, dopamine, everything's being released. So why pick out DMT? Because it's activating a serotonin receptor. If you have massive amounts of serotonin produced, why would it select a tiny amount of DMT to produce an effect when it's being flooded with serotonin? So it just doesn't seem logical to me. There are people that argue with me because they're committed to the belief that DMT is there. It's important, but I just don't think it is. There's no evidence for it.
Is there anything interesting about DMT medicinally that's known? Is there any interesting potential there?
There are some studies. I think David Olson did the first ones showing when you gave DMT to rats or mice, I can't remember which it was, that it stimulated synaptogenesis. It stimulated neurite outgrowth. So I know there are companies now that 600 companies now trying to make money on psychedelics that are looking at DMT as a possible antidepressant. I don't know how they're going to do it, whether it's going to be by injection or what. But I mean, there's some evidence that all these psychedelics have some effect on synaptogenesis and neuritogenesis. Mm-hmm. And DMT apparently does that. It's very short acting. So from a clinical perspective, I guess you could argue that if you were going to treat people for depression and it worked, you could put them in there and you could give them some intravenous DMT and the effect would last 15 or 20 minutes and then it would be over. Mm-hmm. So you wouldn't have to spend hours and hours and hours like you would with LSD or mescaline. So I think it may have some therapeutic value, but it's a weird compound.
Mm-hmm.